So I thought today what we'll do is continue our discussion from last week. So last week we were talking, remember, about the human and how the human is made and designed. And we also talked last week, remember, about the principles of truth and how to discover truth. And that was a very interesting conversation, wasn't it? Because most people do not use the methods to discover truth. So I'd probably like to just do a little bit of revision about the principles of discovering truth. So do you remember what we said were the principles about truth in terms of discovering it and coming to know it? No one can remember. Sandra, and they go across the...
That our brain or our mind is only a tiny parcel of the whole thing.
Yeah, remember there were methods of discovering truth, weren't they? Weren't there? And there were certain types of truth, which we'll talk about in a minute. But when we talk about the methods, most people use their intellect, don't they? So like most people are governed by intellectual, the domination of the intellect, and governed by intellectual assessment. But remember we talked about all the, sorry, I'll write that down. And remember we talked about all of the shortcomings of that. Can you remember what they were? The shortcomings of discovering things through your intellect? Okay. So, Gary?
There's no emotion involved.
No emotion involved, but even more importantly, we come down to Lily.
False beliefs.
True, but more importantly, Sandra?
There's no senses involved.
There's no senses involved. So remember, a lot of the ways you were actually learning are through your senses, aren't they? So through your senses of taste, touch, of sight, your hearing, and all those kind of things. Can we have those phones off? Or in mute, silence them. Yeah, so the senses were a very, very important part. So as Gary also mentioned, the emotions are an important part. And in fact, the emotions are the brain of your soul, whereas your intellect is the spirit body's brain using the intellect. So naturally, the intellect, which many of you have been using to assimilate truth, is not a very effective tool to assimilate truth. And this is why when the intellect only is used, the average person doesn't actually practice truth. They just go back and revert back to their addictions. And their addictions are basically based upon their senses interacting with their emotions. So if you think about what your addictions are, you've got your senses, so your taste, touch and all those kind of senses, and also your sexual feelings, all interacting with how you feel emotionally, and they drive your addictions. In other words, you could say these things drive your loves. And if we call your addictions your corrupted loves, you can see that your senses and your emotion really drive that. But it's also the main way you're learning. You're learning, for example, when people feed your addictions, you're learning through the combination of your senses being satisfied and your emotions being satisfied. And so now you're very, very desirous of having these things satisfied again. Right? So that drives you. And your intellect can scream at you and go, that's a bad idea, but your intellect has very little part to play in what you then decide to do, because your addictions and your emotions, or you could say your loves, your passions and your desires, and your emotions are what are going to drive you in terms of what you do in your life. But interestingly enough, they also drive a lot of how you learn. So that's also an interesting fact of life. So a lot of the ways we actually learn truths are not to do with what is logically presented to you, but rather it's what is sensorially and emotionally presented to you, right? So what might appear to be logic to the intellect quite often is completely illogical from a sensory or emotional perspective. An example of that is, let's say you get trapped and your arm's trapped, right? The logical thing to do might be to cut it off. Your arm, I mean. And in order to get out of the trap, if that's the only way out. but your senses and your emotions are going to want you to resist that. And you can see why, because you might die from cutting your arm off, right? You might bleed to death and so forth. So your logic and your senses are often in disagreement to each other, right? And this is very much the case with regard to everything you do. Your logic and your senses are frequently in complete disagreement with each other. So when it comes to the discovery of truth, senses and our emotions are an important part. But also you could say, in amongst all of these things, there's also the other very important thing, which is your experiences, aren't they? So, a lot of people laugh at me when I talk about all sorts of matters about, spiritual matters, what I know to be spiritual truths. They laugh at me and they say, oh, that's just not possible. You can't really do that. It's impossible for those things to happen. And I go, well, my personal experience is that it's happened, so I know it's happened. So no matter how much you're saying to me it's impossible, I know it's happened. So how can I be convinced otherwise once I've gone through the experience? It's like if you have the experience of tasting a mango, then you've had the experience, right? And somebody could say to you, there's no such thing as a mango, who knows what it is? And you go, of course there is, I've had one, right? So having the experience is a great part of determining truth, right? To actually resolve truth. And this is what the majority of people deny through their intellect. They basically say, in their logic, they say something is not possible. So they use their logic, they use their intellect in their nice, clever way of thinking, in their, you could say, in their pride and their arrogance, they say that's not possible. So the logic is telling them that it's not possible. Their logic, I must say, is telling them, not God's, because, in amongst an infinite universe, there's a lot of things that are possible, right? But the intelligence is saying it's not possible. So now they're trying to say to people who have had experiences and senses, emotions about it being possible, they're trying to say to them that it's not possible. Now, that's not a very logical thing to do, actually, if you think about it. It's not logical to say to a person who swears to you they've had an experience to say, I don't think you really have, right? Because if you have not had that experience, how would you know whether they've had it or not? Right? Now, there might be explanations to their experience that they have then deduced incorrectly from their experience, and that is certainly possible. So you can have an experience. So an example of that is many people have the experience of all of a sudden they have a feeling for a person, and then that person a few minutes later phones them. And they go, oh, that was amazing. But they don't think what might have caused that experience. So it could be all sorts of things. It could be spirits who they can't see, influencing them to think about the person, or the feeling of the thoughts from the person coming at them. Every time a person thinks about you, there's a thought package actually that exits them, and you have the potential to receive it if you're open to such a potential. But the average person doesn't believe all that's true, of course. So they just go, oh, it was just strange. There's no, the average person will not then go in a logical, down a logical process, if you like, to determine the truth of that thing, right? So this is the problem with the determination of truth. So this morning, or this afternoon it is now, isn't it? I wanted to focus on reminding you how truth is determined. Truth is determined primarily from the mixture of experience, emotion and senses all being retained and assessed logically eventually. And unfortunately, the logic of the assessment is often tainted by all your emotions and all your beliefs and everything else. And so what you believe is a logical conclusion from the results of a certain thing may not be logic at all, right? Another example of that is reincarnation, right? There's 20 or 30 signs that the average person who has learned about reincarnation says these are the proofs of reincarnation. But they could also be the proofs of spirit obsession. right? But they don't want to believe in that because that's too emotionally difficult to accept that you're actually possessed or obsessed by somebody else and that person is with you all the time. So the average person doesn't want to accept that, and so they'd prefer to then accept the idea that they've come back again. So that's an example of having an experience that is true, but incorrectly, logically assessing it, and then making an assumption of the truth from it. Do you understand the difference? So frequently when we have experiences, emotions, using our senses, we are then, unfortunately, our mind starts making these things. Now, assumptions or presumptions are very dangerous to you. There's a difference between assumptions and options. Options are, it could be this, it could be that, it could be this, it could be that, and I have no emotional impediment to thinking it might be any of those things. That's an option. An assumption is, I have an emotional impediment to thinking it's that, that, and that, so I'm going to assume it's that. I'm going to assume it's the thing I want to assume. That's a presumption or an assumption, and they are very antagonistic to you discovering truth. Does that make sense to you? So when we talk about the truth about the human soul and how it works, and we talk about truth about life and the truth about God's laws, you might have had experiences with those particular things, but you've got to be very careful about making presumptions or assumptions about those things without full amount of evidence or further investigation. And the further investigation requires experiences, emotions and senses. It's not going to be just a further intellectual investigation. So it's not going to be just like, oh, look it up on the internet type investigation. Because that's next to useless, right? To you, determining truth is next to useless. You need to go through the experience. As many of you have now learned, you look up all sorts of things on the internet, but a lot of it's not even real, right? And you've learned that now. A lot of it can be just a creation of a machine nowadays, where it's not even real, right? So making a presumption or assumption about what is real when you don't really know and you've only had an experience, well, the experiences can be, you could say, they can be remembered and added together, but you need to make sure that you're looking at all the options before you come to a conclusion about what is true. Now, once you've had an experience, of course, many of the options start going out of the window, don't they? Because once you've done it and you know and you've actually gone through the experience, then all of the ideas you had about what it might be and all of the possibilities it could be, they are all pretty much disappearing now because you've gone through an actual experience that has told you a truth. Right? So now you can be a lot more certain once you've had an experience. Now this principle applies to all of God's truths. All of God's truths, all of the truths of the universe are dependent upon you having an experience of them. If you have not had an experience of them, then you don't know them for certain. It's as simple as that. Certainty only comes through, firstly, assessing things, having senses and emotions and assessment, and coming through the assessment and then looking at all the options and then having, you could say, experiments. And it's going to be funny in a way, isn't it, that experience and it's like experiencements. Like having an experiment, having a new experience, another one, and just see what that brings you is going to be a good way of actually learning truth, right? So going through experiments. And this is a great way of determining truth. In fact, from my perspective, that's all of the things I've done in the last 2,000 years have been based upon that fundamental principle. That I look at what I've already learned Then I create a whole series of new experiments and then have an outcome from those experiments. And then I have experiences, and those experiences from those experiments then validate to me whether something is true or not. Now, these things, in order to be true, also have to have this component in them. They must also be loving. Everything that is unloving is a temporary creation in the universe. It's a temporary thing created by humans in the universe. The humans are the only really unloving creature, and anything that happens around them that is unloving is the direct creation of the humans that are also unloving. And this includes even how animals interact with each other. Anything that you perceive as unloving in the way animals interact with each other are all created by the human soul's intentions. So it's all still created by the humans. It's the animals interacting with the human's intention that creates such things. So, but again, if you're just making assumptions and you haven't experimented with that, you wouldn't know that, would you? You'd think the animals are sort of autonomous without your involvement, without your influence. But that's not true. And through experiments, you can come to know the truth of that as well, like through what you do with animals. So every method of determining truth also has to have this love component in it. If there is no love component in it, you can automatically dismiss it as true. And this is a very powerful thing to remember. If you can automatically dismiss something, you don't have to go through further assessment or experiments. You can just dismiss it if you know it to be out of hand, unloving, right? However, it is not your definition of loving. So that's the thing to bear in mind. It's God's definition of loving, God's measure, not yours. So, don't make the assumption that because you believe it's unloving, that from God's perspective it's unloving. An example of that is when somebody feeds your addictions, most of you believe that is loving. God knows that is unloving. He sees the damage to your soul. He sees the sin it creates. He sees the flow-on effects of those sins every time you meet an addiction. But the average person on earth goes, no, that's what love is. Me getting my loves, the things I love, and primarily my senses and emotions has driven that. And it's getting those things met. And when somebody decides to meet them voluntarily for me, then it means they love me. Right? So don't presume that. So it's very important to understand that this is the way God loves determines. So the way God loves determines the truth of a matter or not. And if you're connected to God, obviously you're more and more in tune with the way God loves. And if you're more in tune with the way God loves now, you can also assess truth more rapidly. And this is very beneficial for your future. If you can bear that in mind, that if you're in alignment with God and the way God loves, now when it comes to determining further truths, it's going to be easier for you to do such a thing than it is for anybody who's just trying to use their mind to determine a truth. Because the mind itself, throw that away, the mind itself is just the intellect, and that itself is no good even for determining physical truths, let alone all the truths of the universe. You need these things involved to determine a truth, and these are by far the greatest things. The senses, the emotions, and the experience are by far the greatest things that determine the truth of the thing. But if you bear in mind that those things have to be in alignment with love in order for truth to be present, and not in alignment with your love, the way you think you should be loved or the way you think you should love, but the way God defines love to be. Right? So, very important to factor in your assessment of truth, the idea that not only are my senses and my emotions and my experience they are the most definite things that would cause me to recognize truths, but when those things are in alignment with God's love, now I know for certain they must be true, even if I've yet to have an experience. So this is how you can develop faith in future experiences. So once I became at one with God, the way I determined that a union of the soulmate must be possible is because I saw that it was in alignment with the love that I'd already received from God. So then it became a matter of determining how to do that, and that took me 2,000 years to work out. Right? When I say 2,000 years, that's 2,028 years, take away around 32 years to work that out. So it took me a long time to work out how to achieve that, how to actually go through the experience. But I knew way, way back in the first century that was possible. Does that make sense? But it took so long to get to that point because of all the things I had to learn, and not only myself, but also all the things Mary had to learn in order for that to occur. We had to learn a lot of things. And then you could share those things using your intellect with others, but that's not good enough for them. They were going to have to also do exactly the same, and they would have to use their senses and their emotions and eventually have experiences that would cause them to go through the same thing. Does that make sense? So somebody can share a truth with you and you can think you know it, but you really don't. You really don't. It's not until you go through the actual experience that you really know it. So I thought I knew it was possible that this soulmate union could occur, but I didn't know how to achieve it at all. Right? So I knew it was possible because it was in alignment with the love and in alignment with my senses and in alignment with my emotions and in alignment with my experience, particularly once I met Mary, more in alignment with my experience. So I knew it was possible, but I just didn't know how to achieve it. And to do that, I had to have experiments. I had to go through experiments to learn how to do that. And any assumption that I made was an enemy of my experiments. You understand? So every presumption you make is an enemy of your desire for more truth. Because it fundamentally prevents a lot of things. When you make an assumption or a presumption, you're thinking one thing and you're neglecting the possibility of all the other things. And so it's an enemy of you actually finding out the truth. Does that make sense to you? So this is why when you do things that are presumptuous or based on pride or based on arrogance or based on a lack of humility, based on the fact that you have not admitted to yourself that you don't know a thing, when you do that, you're actually constraining your future, you're limiting your potential growth for the future.